Hi everyone, and welcome to our Biology Daily Booster number 13 in the series. This is on the advanced information list for those of you doing foundation biology. So bear in mind this is not listed on the higher specifically, but as we know there are no topics that will not be assessed on these papers. What we're going to be looking at today then is the kind of first part of the nervous system and how it actually helps us control different things in our body. So the first thing we need to understand are some key terms. The word stimulus tells us that there's a change in the environment. So wherever you see the word stimulus, that is referring to some kind of environmental change. Could be temperature, could be pain, could be pressure. Anything that's an environmental change is the stimulus. Second word is the word receptor. Now receptors are groups of cells that can detect these different stimuli. So they are actually part of the body, usually in the skin or the sense organs like the eyes, etc., that allow us to detect those changes. Third key term, effector. Now effectors are glands or muscles that are going to bring about a response. And remember, the response is the change that we bring about as a result of detecting this stimulus. So as far as muscles go, that means they contract, and glands will release hormones. The last term we need to be aware of for today is the word CNS, or central nervous system. So the central nervous system is your brain and spinal cord. And that does come up as a nice simple question every once in a while. What is the central nervous system, or CNS, made from? Brain and spinal cord are the two things we need to write down. When we talk about neurons, we need to know that there are three types: sensory, relay, and motor neurons. The sensory neurons are the ones that connect our receptor cells to the central nervous system. The relay are the ones that go from our sensory neurons to the motor neurons. And finally, the motor neurons are the ones that go from the central nervous system to the effector. So remember that sequence: sensory, relay, motor, because that's going to help you out a lot with when we come to talk about the different responses we have in our nervous system. So the first response we're going to look at is a voluntary response. So this is where we're actually going to be considering what we are doing before we actually bring about our response to something. So you can see we've got a little flowchart at the top that shows us the steps involved. So we start off with a stimulus, a change in the environment. That is detected by the receptor cells. Those receptor cells then send an electrical impulse along the sensory neuron to the spinal cord. Because this is going to be a voluntary response, then we're going to send that information up the spinal cord to the brain. The brain is then going to process this information and make the decision about what response we're going to have here. It then sends that electrical impulse back down to the spinal cord, which then sends the electrical impulse through the motor neuron to the effector, and the effector then brings about the response. While that sounds like a lot is happening, that all happens in around 0.7 seconds. So we're still talking about less than 1 second for all of that to have taken place. The reason your brain is so important, aside from the fact it's storing all of this great information to allow you to answer questions on your exam paper, it receives huge amounts of information from all these different sensory receptors around your body at the same time. And what it does is it processes all of that information so that it brings about what we refer to as a coordinated response. So that means rather than just saying, oh, hold on, I'm sensing that there is some increase in temperature, we're then also taking the information from our eyes, for example, to say, it's because there's a fire in front of me, therefore I need to run in the other direction. So it's actually taking a lot of information to then bring about this coordinated response to make sure we're responding in the right way. And it can send a range of impulses to different parts of the body to bring about the right response. This question has come up previously, asking about the level of control. So what they've done is they've given you a question about why some regions of the body we have really quite fine control over movement. Think about fingers. And then other parts of the body, it's really not very fine. So you can basically move your leg kind of forward and back kind of thing. Now, the reason for that is all down to how many connections there are between your neurons and the muscles. So there'll be the motor neurons and muscles, remember. If we have a large number of connections between the motor neurons and the muscles, that means that we can have much finer control. We can identify which bits of the muscles or how many muscle fibers we are going to stimulate at any given point to bring about this much more controlled motion. If we just have sort of a very small number of connections going to our muscle, then it's going to have just this very big effect. It will either contract or it won't. So what we see, the number of connections is directly correlated to the fine movement that we get. We've already mentioned this, but we're going to just go through in a bit more detail about our two types of response. So we have voluntary responses, the ones that you have a conscious decision to actually have. So things like deciding to speak, moving your arm a particular way just because you want to wave at someone, for example. Those are voluntary. You are deciding to do that. The involuntary responses are the ones that happen without you thinking about it. So things like when you walk into a bright room, your pupil contracts to then protect your retina from the brighter light. Which brings us very nicely onto our reflex actions. Now, the reflex arc is something you need to know. These are responses that are going to happen incredibly quickly, and generally it's to do with protecting you from danger or death. You can see 0.2 seconds, so we've shaved half a second off the time here. All reflexes are involuntary, so that means that you don't have to think about them to bring it about. So we've got our flowchart here to show us what's happening once more. We start off with the stimulus, so some kind of change in the environment which is sensed by the receptor cells. Those receptor cells then cause an electrical impulse to be passed through the sensory neuron to the spinal cord. Once in the spinal cord, that electrical impulse passes through the relay neuron to the motor neuron. Notice how it's not gone to the brain at this point. And then the electrical impulse travels through the motor neuron to the effector, and the effector will either contract if it's a muscle or secrete a hormone if it's a gland, which brings about the response. Now, do note my little point at the bottom there. When we are talking about transmission in neurons, please use the term electrical impulse. Don't just say electricity or impulse, because some of the mark schemes have been quite specific about the phrasing. So if you're just saying the message is transmitted from the receptor cells to the sensory neuron to the spinal cord, you're not getting the marks here, folks. If you say that the receptor cells send an electrical impulse through the sensory neuron to the spinal cord, you've just got the mark. You haven't really changed your understanding of the process, you've just tweaked your language in your answer. So electrical impulse, very important here. Also, do not just copy the flow chart. If we're talking about this being a 3, 4, 5, 6 mark question, do not just draw that flow chart and expect to get top marks. You've got to use that as a revision tool, but when you actually write it, use a sentence. So that means you've got to upgrade it. Rather than just saying stimulus to receptor cells, the stimulus is detected by the receptor cells. So all we're doing is using that as our starting point, but change it into more detailed answer when you actually write it on the paper, please. So final thing for today, as always, is to head on over to have a go at the quiz to see how well you've understood our work today. If there are any topics that you're not 100% certain on, then you can always just look at those videos on the channel. They will help you out, obviously, to understand those in more detail. And don't forget to join us once more tomorrow for our next Daily Booster.